Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn entitled A Gesture of Hospitality for Asylum Seekers, an analysis of mobilization actions by Bridges Not Borders Collective at Roxham Road. My name is Patrick Donovan. I am Research Associate with the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, QUESCREN, at Concordia University, and I will be your moderator for today. Before continuing, and especially since we're talking about immigration, I'd like to acknowledge that Indigenous people still live in Montreal, where I'm speaking from today, and they've lived here for thousands of years prior to the arrival of European settlers, immigrants, colonists, colonizers, what have you. The Ghanaian-Gahéga Nation is recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters today, and Tujake, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within this community. I am especially interested in today's topic because I studied immigration welcoming initiatives as part of my PhD thesis in history, but I looked at things back in the 18th and 19th century in Quebec City, my former home, which was the main port of entry for immigrants to Canada at the time. And you realize looking back at this history that there's always been lots of volunteers working to welcome immigrants, and many of them were English speaking. The Quebec Emigrant Society, founded in 1819, was among the earliest such volunteer groups. And later in the 1830s, there were groups like the St. George's Society, which worked to welcome English and Welsh immigrants, St. Andrew's for the Scots, the St. Patrick's Society for all the Irish and later just Irish Catholics, and the Irish Protestant Benevolent Society eventually. So they didn't just organize parades and balls. Their main business was welcoming immigrants, putting them in touch with the right people, ensuring they get jobs, and so on. And the role of English speakers continues to this day, but it's taken a very different political dimension since the 1970s. The question comes up, is it legitimate for Anglophones to participate in immigrant reception given the projet de francisation de la société québécoise? And my colleague Lorraine O'Donnell and others looked at this in a 2016 report, and I'll share the link later, and showed that most of the organizations largely run by English speakers today play a complementary role, a bridge building role, so welcoming in English and French, but steering them towards the tools necessary to integrate into a majority Francophone society. Today's presentations looks at one of these immigrant reception initiatives, largely steered by English speakers. And so we're excited to have with us today Dr. Chedly Belkhodja, Professor, School of Community and Public Affairs, and co-director of QUESCREN, and also Cassandre Gratton, MA student in Political Science at Concordia University. I'd like to say this event was made possible through the financial support of the Secretariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, the government of Quebec. And now I'll introduce our two speakers. Chedly Belkhodja is professor at the School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia University and the co-director of QUESCREN. He holds a BA in Political Science from the Université de Moncton and a Master's in Political Science from the Université de Montréal. He completed his Diplôme d'études approfondies and his PhD in Political Science at l'Université de Montesquieu in Bordeaux, France. And his research focuses on immigration policies and mobility of migrants in the case of less common destinations. He's also interested in the processes of integration and inclusion. Cassandre Gratton is a second-year political science MA student at Concordia University. She's worked in both the academic and community sectors and seeks to conduct research that is grounded in an open, multidisciplinary approach. Her research interests include immigration, public policy, and political communication. So I pass the mic to Chedly and Cassandre. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for this introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be able to present today this work we have been doing for the last 2 years. It's an ongoing project. It's something that started back in when I was doing another research in Moncton, New Brunswick, and also with comparability with other cities in Sherbrooke and Granby with my colleague Michel Vatsalaroussi. We were looking at the time at the welcoming of Syrian refugees. And what came out in that research at the time was the role of volunteers. In Moncton, mostly, where you had the bulk of the Syrian refugees were government assisted refugees, very large families, people who had a lot of vulnerability and At the time, the settlement structure in place in Moncton had a lot of difficulties coping with the arrival of the Syrian refugees. And through this research, I had always this idea of trying to understand what can happen beyond the model of settlement, beyond the very institutionalized model of the settlement sector in Canada. So I was interested in paying attention to the work of citizens who want to help. There is a lot of, we even when the Syrians came, there were some sponsorships and programs, but still what really was fascinating in the work I did was to talk to these volunteers, people who want to help through their own time. And I think that was a big piece of the research that we started by looking at Bridges Not Borders. The other piece I want just to put is the border. So a lot of the work we're doing now is on borderlands, borderscapes. How do we consider a border? And our research is grounded in a critical perspective on borders, seen as a dynamic concept, a place where you see relations between different actors. And in that sense, I think the border for us, what's important for us is to have a viewpoint on the border. And the question I would ask is, what is our viewpoint on the Canada-U.S. border? And I think this is where we situate our work. Final point, I'd like to, and Patrick made reference to this, is something that it was not in the initial research, is the history of the region we're studying. La Montérégie, the Eastern Townships. Bridges Not Borders is located in the region of Hemingford. I think it's fascinating also to go back in history and consider the history and the multiple layers of history and identity in the region we're studying. So when Patrick makes references to immigration from the US, from Ireland, Scottish, there's a lot of threads, of layers of population mobility in the region, and it created a region, a very interesting region to study. Also, when we think of Bridges Not Borders, and Cassandre will show it, it's grounded in localism, very strong local approach to helping, to solidarity with migrants. This goes back, I think, also in history. We haven't dig in a lot in this, but the region that we're interested by has been very, defined also by this history of localism, of villages, and we think it's quite interesting to situate Bridges Not Borders in this context. So I will let Cassandre actually run through a very interesting PowerPoint to show you what we did.
So our presentation broadly is called A Gesture of Hospitality for Asylum Seekers, a case study of the citizen group Bridges Not Borders. So Chedly already went over sort of the importance of this work and what led us to take an interest in it. And just to give you a bit more specific data and context on the Canada-U.S. border, as you can see on the left, the two graphs that are there show that essentially, just to keep in mind, it's really Quebec that receives the most asylum seekers, the most irregular arrivals through the border. So the BC and Manitoba receive a little bit, but really, really small numbers compared to Quebec. So most of the border crossings are in Quebec. And also in terms of the country of origins of those who cross, in 2018, as you can see, most of them were from Nigeria. So that's just some like background data to keep in mind for the context of the Canada-U.S. border. And we first took an interest in this subject by doing like summary analysis of the media coverage of the articles that were covering border crossings at Roxham Road between January of 2017 to August of 2018, because as you can see, there was a big uptick in the number of border crossings, but also in the number of articles that were covering the subject. There was a lot of interest in the border crossings because they were rising, so people had a lot of concerns. And so we did some content analysis to see what the main themes were in the media coverage, and we saw that the reception capacity was really a central concern. So there was a lot of worry. There was a feeling of crisis. A lot of people called it a border crisis. There were some analogies made with the European context where a lot of irregular asylum seekers were crossing borders, etc. There were a lot of alarmist messages. There were some politicians that called the border a passoire, all those kinds of alarmist messages. But we also saw some calls for compassion, some human portrayals. So, for example, interviews with people who had crossed the borders, trying to understand like why they had done so, etc. But overall, there was really like a clear, strong tension, and it was a very polarized debate. But what we really saw was that even in the more compassion-oriented aspects of the debate, there was really little place given to citizen groups. And that's something that we thought was missing from the debate, given that like more local groups, especially close to the borders, are the ones that were living with this situation, seeing the situation, and have, really the more directly impacted by it. So we decided to take a specific interest in that because we thought it was lacking from the general debate. So how we decided to proceed, as Chedly mentioned, we also took a specific perspective of borders that focuses on human and citizen dynamics. So what we could call the staging of the border. So who is at the border? How are they organized? What kind of dynamics are they facing? And so we did, as I mentioned, that was based on the media coverage analysis. But then what we did is we conducted 3 semi-structured interviews with founding members of the citizen group Bridges Not Borders, which I'm going to describe in a bit more detail later. So we wanted to validate and clarify some of the context around the creation of the group, understand what their motivations were, what kind of actions were they taking, what kind of difficulties were they facing, etc. And we also took a look at a lot of the media materials that was produced by the group. Specifically, we focused on 108 blog posts that they published between November 16, 2017 to March 8th, 2020, which is when, the border was closed because of COVID. So that was how we took an interest in the group. And just to put the group in a bit more context still, they are near Roxham Road, which, as you can see on the map, is really a sort of road that crosses from the US to Canada. It's actually an old official point of entry that's no longer used, but there's still like a practicable road, which is why it's very used for border crossings, because the rest of the land is forests and it's really hard to navigate or practice. And so, as you can see, Hemmingford is about 9 kilometers northwest of Roxham Road. And that's Hemmingford is where Bridges Not Borders is based. And as you can see in the graph, again, it's really Quebec. That's the biggest uptick in border crossings in 2017 and 2018. That's when the numbers were the highest. So it all took place on Roxham Road is the place to remember. And just to give you maybe a sense of the spirit in which the group was created, and how close they are to Roxham Road and how they were impacted by it. This is an extract from Info Hemingford, which is a community bulletin. And they are talking about Sue Heller, who is a well-known organizer there. And essentially, every year she organizes what is called the Wool Gathering, which is like a community event where people reunite and do all kinds of crafts and social activities. And she's being asked in this extract about the disruption that the increase in border crossing has caused. And what she says, she answers, why should I complain? I have all I need and they have nothing. And I think this really illustrates well the kind of spirit with which some citizens responded upon seeing the arrivals, even though it did have an impact on their lives. Some of them really saw a need, an opportunity to help. And that's essentially how Bridges Not Borders was created. So maybe to give more specific details from the founding members of the groups. So essentially the group was created in July of 2017. And the first time that they kind of decided to act and to maybe formalize a little bit their group was during the Wool Gathering of Sue Heller that I was mentioning earlier. Essentially, during this event, there was a protest that was organized at Roxham Road by a far-right group. And there was another protest by a far-left group. And some of the people that were present at the event decided that they did not want this to be the only voice that was communicating regarding what was happening at the border. So essentially, they decided to get a bit more organized. But they had already started to be involved in what was happening at the border through the United Church. So the United Church there had already started to help the RCMP to deal with the influx that was happening. So they had the opportunity to bring like muffins and other really sort of small gestures to help out with the people that were arriving. Excuse me. And so, yeah, just to give like a bit, I think those are quotes that represent really well the kind of spirit in which the group was created. So Frances, who is one of the founding members of the group, she really insists on the history of Hemingford as an active community. So she says that like there were already over 30 local little groups that were doing things, that were getting involved in their community. And she refers to it as a historically English way of organizing. So very volunteer based. And there were already a lot of communities that were existing in the town. So it felt almost natural for them when they saw that there was a concern regarding the groups that were coming to the border and responding in different ways to the arrivals. Excuse me. So yeah, they really wanted to respond to it, and it seemed natural given the already existing culture of mobilizing and organizing in the community. And Wendy, who is another founding member, she also sort of highlights the importance of being a local voice. So she explained that it was really when they saw far right and far left groups, they didn't want those to be the only voice in the media. So they wanted to organize and really try to be a voice for another perspective of what was happening at the border. So that's kind of how the group got started and the kind of spirit that animated the beginning of the group. And so they created Bridges Not Borders, which is not like a super formal. They call themselves Bridges Not Borders, but they're not incorporated. They're not an official NGO, but they're still an organized and mobile group. They describe themselves as a group of people living in Hemmingford and the surrounding area, not far from Roxham Road, where people have been crossing the USA-Canadian border irregularly, in order to seek asylum and safety in Canada. And they state that they are concerned for their welfare and want to bring attention to the difficulties that they face entering Canada. And there are basically three main areas of interventions through which they do that. So you have solidarity at the border, surveillance of state practices at the border, and finally raising awareness about realities at the border. So the first area of action, solidarity at the border, is done through essentially what they do is that they cross the border to the US, and from the US, they provide some support, emotional support, but also some material support to people who are about to cross the border. So sometimes they offer small gifts like water glasses. They offered some winter accessories during the winter, and they offer also some information. So there were some issues with people not knowing if they could cross or not, how they could cross, etc. So they were there to provide some information. And they also offered some community exchanges. So basically, once some people had crossed, so asylum seekers, they invited them back to the community. There were some picnics organized just to show them some support, make them feel welcome. They also did some blog posts based on the crossings. So every time that they went to the border, I think it was every Sunday, they would write down what they saw, explain how it happened, to kind of show from a very close and very sort of unmediated way the reality at the border. And they also had relationships with some other groups on the other side of the border. So Plattsburgh Cares was one of them, Plattsburgh, which is also very close to Roxham Road. And that's also interesting to note because it's very anchored in the historical reality of the sort of porous border with the US. So the fact that they like easily could create a relationship with groups beyond the border. And so just to give you a bit of sense of how this started, as I mentioned, it started with the United Church. Yeah, it was just like this idea of providing simple but very symbolic gestures. So even though it was like very sort of low-key, you could say, they could tell that it provided a lot of support and it made a lot of difference to those who were crossing. And then with the blog, what is interesting to note is that eventually through those observations of the RCMP officers who were intercepting the people at the border, they eventually noticed that some officers were having a problematic behavior toward asylum seekers. So that brings us to our next point, which is surveillance of Border Patrol practices, which we decided to refer as a gesture of underveillance. So basically, it's really about citizens sort of surveilling the state and holding them to account. And they did some small-scale lobbying of local politicians and local authorities to try and ensure that this would be the problematic behavior that they were seeing. So that was like officers telling people to go cross at regular points of entry, even though they knew that they would be refused at regular points of entry, was problematic. So they wanted to change that. And what's really interesting to note is that they really did this in a sort of non-confrontational way, and being local and already having a good pre-existing relationship with the local RCMP officers really allowed them to make some concrete changes. As you can see from the quote, the RCMP was actually really receptive to it, and there were some concrete changes in the behavior of the officers. And they stated that the quality of the behavior improved over time. So that's really interesting to know this sort of local dynamic here. And then finally, they used their experiences at the border to have a media presence. So they really wanted to talk about what was happening at the border, why these people were coming. As I mentioned in the beginning, they wanted to offer a local voice that would talk about this issue. And they also really wanted to do it in an open way. So they wanted to remain open to dialogue, not be in a confrontational approach. So as opposed to far right, but also far left groups, they wanted to do it in a more daily sort of local based way. So for example, they were talking about instead of organizing a protest, you would, for example, talk with your neighbor, talk with someone at the bank, you hear someone in the street mentioning the issue, and you just do some work trying to understand, for example, why are they unhappy that the border crossings are happening, and try and maybe undo some myths and other things like that. So those are the three main ways in which the group was taking actions. And basically what is really interesting to note, and especially in the context of this presentation today regarding English-speaking communities, is how much we really saw how a lot of it was based on the historical capital of rural Anglophone communities. So you can see that there was a lot of reliance on charity. So it started really with the church as a more traditional form of charity, if we could say, and then it evolved into something a bit more organized and a bit more political. But it's still really interesting to note that that's how it started. We can say that it's really heavily based on a community identity. So they really identify as a local group, and they really wanted to use their really specific expertise that they were developing by being and living close to the border to really take action. And what we see is also the importance and the specificities of local approaches. So we can really see that the fact that they had this local expertise of organizing, of charity, of providing a local voice, it really, really contributed to the group being able to organize and ultimately really make a difference in the lives of those who were crossing, but also in their own communities, making their communities more welcoming. So that's it for the more concrete analysis of the group, but then Chedly is going to finish on some more theoretical conclusions that we reach from doing this work. So I'm going to let him finish the presentation.
I'm just going to say a few things. This research really is also allows us to compare with other cases of borders, borderscapes, borderlands, and I think the whole notion of hospitality is very present in the literature now on how we can see the border differently and act differently when we think of migration. So I think hospitality in our case, and I'm not going to go through this. I'm just going to clarify the whole notion of the passage of the border. I think it's really interesting when Bridges Not Borders, when interviewing the founding members and also reading the blogs, they're quite elaborated. The blogs will explain in details this notion of the passage and this notion of being able to show solidarity and hospitality towards migrants who have been on a journey from far away and getting close to this border and hesitating. Some of them are not sure, are scared, they don't know what's going to happen. And the fact that you see these collective, these groups of citizen, Plattsburgh Care and Bridges Not Borders present is a show of solidarity. And I think in the literature, you see a lot of interesting research on this way of defining hospitality. Hospitality is not only charity. Hospitality for us is also a political gesture. So in a way, Bridges Not Borders is reacting to an hospitable state. So to a state that wants to close the border. So a state that wants to address its sovereignty. And we see this now clearly in the case in Europe with Belarus and Poland. We see the representation of the border when the state wants us to look at a border. We think by studying citizens' initiatives, we see something different, and I think it's also a political gesture when we read the way they define hospitality. So finally, maybe next slide. I think the research will contribute to highlight what some citizen mobilization reveal about the way in which citizens can think and act on the border. It's another narrative of the border. And I think that's really what comes up from working with Bridges Not Borders. It's also something that will evolve. I think when I go to the last point, I know with the pandemic, it's been very difficult for the group, but they collaborate a lot with other groups, Plattsburgh Cares and other initiatives in the state of New York, even in the state of Maine. They have been learning from other forms of hospitality and welcome initiatives for migrants. The border is still closed, but we know it will open again. And even next Monday, I think there will be an announce. That's what the group said to us. And it will bring another, we'll see what happens. So we still have some work to do with this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Chedly and Cassandre, for this presentation. I invite everyone to write questions in the chat. I will start with a question of my own. In terms of the press coverage you looked at, did you notice a difference in the Anglophone and Francophone press with regard to the coverage of the Roxham Road crossing?
No, in that case, we only looked at Francophone media coverage, actually. The media that we chose were only Francophone. So, but it would be really interesting maybe in the future, because we do want to continue this analysis in a more focused way and in a bit more depth. So language would definitely be something to consider maybe in the future for this part of our analysis for sure, yeah.
Question from Lorraine O'Donnell. Did you notice any differences in welcoming practices in New Brunswick and Quebec?
Maybe what I realized in the case of the Syrian, when the Syrians came in Canada, 2015, winter 2015, early 2016, when the in New Brunswick, it was initially something that was organized by the settlement sector, but like I said, there was a sense of loss of control where they were not able to address the arrivals of families that started to arrive every night in Moncton at the airport. There was a situation of panic almost, and citizens themselves, people who were engaged in the community, decided to organize a bit more themselves. So I think it was less political also, if there's a difference. I mean, from what I see from Bridges Not Borders, which is grounded in a community we're talking about a small group of individuals who have been engaged in other social justice initiatives in the region. So there's this sense of maybe a more political reaction in the group. Also, you have people who have a lot of knowledge on migration and immigration. So this is also something that we see in some of these collectives, people who are maybe more on the periphery, not involved in the traditional way of getting involved with settlement and integration, but more involved in activism. And so I think we see this. But really what Cassandre said also that I find interesting is that they want to, there was some tensions early summer, that's hot summer of 2017 at the border, where you had the far right, but you also had some groups on the left who were openly pushing for opening the borders, for which it's their political stand, no border initiatives. The Bridges Not Borders felt they were not à l'aise, entre guillemets, in also being that far on the left. They had another strategy.
I'd like to hear more about the COVID pandemic and its impact. You know, we know about the hardening of the border and the calls to minimize contacts because of lockdown. How did that impact concretely the welcoming initiatives and the activities of the group?
Well, initially our work was more to look at the 3 years that Cassandre showed, 2017 to 2019. There's a we realized that with COVID, the group actually for a while was not working as much. It was en veilleuse. It stopped almost, but then they realized that individuals were trying to cross and they were pushed back and a bit in lost, drifting in the state of New York. Plattsburgh, they were collaborating, connecting with Plattsburgh Cares and trying to see where these individuals were going. They were not able to cross and they were a bit stuck along the border. So there's been a lot of work of collaborating, and also one member told us that they're receiving a lot of mails. This is new also. People they know now this group, and some people in the States are sending mails to Bridges Not Borders to know what to do. So they're providing information. They cannot provide immigration information, but they can provide some guidance maybe for these individuals.
So Lorraine would like to ask a question out loud. Lorraine, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, I really appreciated the presentation, and Cassandre, I was very gratified. I think that was me that you were quoting from 2012. That's great. So this idea of historical capital that I developed was, as you explained, this notion of a tradition of welcoming immigrants. It was mostly based on my knowledge of the Quebec City scenario where I had lived and I knew people involved. So my question is, did you find that was like, did that resonate when you thought of what your interviewees were saying? Like, for instance, I was interested that you referred to the Anglican Church, I believe, or United Church, I forget. United. Yeah. Did you find it made sense? I'd love to hear your feedback on that concept I developed and whether, you know, you could refine it or critique it in any way.
Yeah, it definitely resonated. We were doing some readings to, because as Chedly mentioned, this idea of like English speaking communities and the tradition and etc. Was less a part of our initial research. So we started to take an interest in that. And this concept really resonated with what the interviewers were saying for sure, because it was almost what really came out of the interviews was how natural it seemed to organize and take action. And that's something that you don't see in a lot of other, like from my personal experience in community organizing, like it's hard to get people involved, but for them it seems so natural. So I think there's definitely something there, and something that we could keep expanding on, and how in those communities, in some communities, there's already such a tradition of getting involved, and it seems so natural when you see some people in distress or something unjust, to take action, to organize. So yeah, this idea of historical capital really resonated, and I keep thinking about it, because it's really interesting to better understand, like, not only how did they react to this specific situation, but how that's inscribed in a longer history, a longer tradition. So yeah, I don't have any critiques. I think we're gonna definitely keep digging and using that concept to think about it further. So yeah.
Thank you.
I could add also that what really struck me also when I invited Francis, I invited some of these members to present at conferences with other key stakeholders active in Quebec, referring to immigration. And people were just really not, they couldn't, for them, it was a bit odd to see citizens getting involved or just wanting to be involved in a sector that is really institutionalized. So even with the crossing at Roxham, I know in Montreal there were organizations that were very active, present in receiving immigrants and helping migrants, for the case of Haitians in Montreal. But I know also that there was the creation of this table between different key stakeholders run by la TCRI, la Table de Concertation des Réfugiés. So there was this institutionalized component of the sector, and groups, collectives, they're completely under the radar. They're not, and maybe it's okay. I'm not saying that. What we're saying in our in the work we're doing is it's interesting to move the lens and to look at different forms of mobilization and to try to understand what they're bringing, what they're doing. And there is a contextual piece to it also that is historical, sociological, the way things work. I've been doing a lot of work recently on the border between France and Italy, looking at what is happening in the Alps, in people crossing in small villages, and there's a history of crossings also at different borders. People wanting to help, people helping during the Second World War, making sure that some population were able to cross. This sense of hospitality, I think also. So there is the comparative piece that we think is really interesting, and also probably going also in a historical perspective also to see how it relates to the region.
I just have another point. Part of my thinking about that idea is most English speakers in Quebec have a clear sense of their immigrant, or in some cases forced migration past. Some people are descendants of enslaved people, for example, but in most cases, in most cases, even if it was immigration en catastrophe, it was still people choosing to migrate. Whereas the Québécois de souche population, as a rule, does not use the term immigrant to describe their experience. It's the colonisation. It's a different heritage, and I'm curious to know whether the researchers have anything to say about that. But if that makes a difference, that's why I was curious about what you found in New Brunswick, because if you don't have a sense that you yourself are a descendant of an immigrant who had to struggle, you know, as an immigrant and might have benefited from immigrant welcoming initiatives in the past, you might, you know, it's speculation. You might have less of a sense of identification with immigrants, but that, you know, I can't.
But I mean,
back that
when
up.
it's interesting now, I see why you asked me about New Brunswick. But when I did this field work in Moncton, I talked to volunteers, and some had maybe the profile of an immigration background and a sense that will do things, but others were Francophone Acadians who never had no knowledge, but who were struck by one thing is with the Syrian was the picture of the young Syrian boy on the beach. Some were making relation to a moment of the tragedy, who would, you know, say, I need to do something. And they would realize that the settlement sector or the agency who was supposed to do the work was not able to cope, was not doing things well. And so that's why I wrote there's a piece I wrote on this, and the title was Beyond the Settlement Model. The need to go beyond the settlement model in some situation. But the settlement model also is very, you know, doesn't want to make room to other actors. Sometimes it's funded. I mean, there's issues. I mean, it was quite interesting to do interviews at the time where you could feel that tension between the settlement model and citizens who just wanted to do things. And that also has its, you know, it can lead to places that you don't want, where who control the notion of, you know, what's going to happen. But it was something that maybe in a way we can see with, I see more with Bridges Not Borders and what happened at Roxham. It's there is this this group that has connection with its environment. With we did ask people live in the region. There is this these people, these founding members have been in the region for long. They came from somewhere else. But they're very well grounded in Hemmingford.
I'd like to thank Chedly and Cassandre for their presentation. Thank you all for attending today's event. Closing, I would like to acknowledge again that this event was made possible through the financial support of the Secretariat pour relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. QUESCREN also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research and Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. Thank you also to our tech manager for today's events, Norma Tolhurst, and to translator Sheena Blaze. Thanks again for being here, and we wish you all a great day. See you next time.
Thank you.